Welcome to the sixth part of my full jazz piano course here on YouTube. Today we're going to talk about modal interchange, also called borrowed chords. This is simultaneously both a very useful and kind of useless concept, as I'll explain shortly. But before we get into specifics, let's define what modal interchange actually means. The first concept we'll need is that of a parallel key. So a parallel key of a particular scale is another scale built on the same root. For example, C major and C harmonic minor, these two scales, are parallel scales, or sometimes called parallel keys. Another example, C major and C Lydian are also parallel. We haven't really discussed modes or what the Lydian scale is yet, but even if you haven't encountered it, you can still understand the basic definition. We now come to the definition of a borrowed chord or modal interchange. Basically, when you're playing in a particular key, you can use chords from all of its parallel keys. So if you're playing in the key of C major, you can borrow chords or use chords from the C harmonic minor, the C Lydian, or any scale built on the same root. Let's make this concrete. Here's the C major scale, and here are the chords built on the C major scale. We have a C major, D minor, E minor, F major, G major, A minor, B diminished, and back to C major. Now let's look at the C harmonic minor. We have a C minor major 7, we have a D minor flat and fifth, we have an E flat augmented major 7, an F minor 7, a G dominant 7, an A flat major 7, and finally a B diminished 7. We could use any of these chords when playing in the key of C major. That's the point of modal interchange. Now, why did I say modal interchange is kind of useless? The idea is that there are so many different scales that you can pretty much come up with any chord you desire. I mean, name a chord and there's a parallel scale that you can borrow it from. When you have so much choice, so much freedom, the concept kind of becomes useless. So why is it mentioned so often when dealing with harmony and jazz and so forth? Well, the reason is that there's a small group of recurring borrowed chords that people tend to use, and they kind of use the concept of modal interchange to justify borrowing them. I mean, you don't have to call it modal interchange if you don't want to, as long as you are familiar with some of these more popular options, which we're going to cover now. As I mention these special borrowed chords, I'll mention from which parallel key they're taken and also their functional role. Remember, we're trying to frame everything in this course in terms of functional harmony. Is this chord really a substitute for a tonic, a subdominant, a dominant, or maybe something else? Okay, the first chord is a 2 minor flat and fifth. We've just seen that it's borrowed from the parallel harmonic minor. In terms of its function, it plays the role of a subdominant, meaning it leads into the dominant. For example, let's say you're playing a 2-5-1 in the key of C major, meaning you're playing a D minor to a G to a C, or with sevenths, D minor 7th, G dominant 7th, C major 7th. The D minor 7th plays the role of a subdominant, meaning that you could substitute it for a 2 minor flat and fifth. So instead of the D minor 7th, you could play a D minor 7 flat and fifth. It would sound like this. Here's another example where we swap out an F major 7th for a D minor 7 flat and fifth in the key of C major. So we're swapping out a subdominant, a 4 major 7th, for a borrowed chord, which is a 2 minor 7th flattened 5. Our next borrowed chord is a 4 minor, which is usually either a 4 minor 6 chord or 4 minor 7 chord. In the key of C major, we're talking about either an F minor 6 or an F minor 7. These are borrowed from the parallel minor key and play the functional role of a subdominant. They lead into the dominant. Let's take an example. Let's take a 2-5-1 in the key of C major, and let's swap out the D minor 7th, which plays the role of a subdominant, with either an F minor 6 or an F minor 7. Our third example is that of a flattened 7th dominant 7th chord. In the key of C major, our 7th degree is a B, so flattening it will give us a B flat, and so this chord would be a B flat dominant 7th. This kind of plays the role of a dominant chord, and it's borrowed from the C minor parallel key. A few examples on how to use it. Again, starting from a 2-5-1 in the key of C major, we substitute our flattened 7th dominant 7th chord for the G dominant 7th. Let's take something a little bit more complicated. Let's take a C major 7th to an A minor 7th to an F major 7th to a G dominant 7th. And let's make two substitutions. Let's swap the F major 7th for an F minor 7th. And let's swap the G dominant 7th for a B flat dominant 7th. It would sound like this. Here's one more interesting borrowed chord. This is the sharpened 4 minor 7 flat 5 chord. Sounds kind of complicated, but let's work it out. Let's do it in the key of C major. The 4th degree in the key of C major is an F. Sharpening it gives us an F sharp. A minor 7th would mean an F sharp minor 7th. And as noted, we flatten the 5th, so we'd get an F sharp minor 7th flattened 5th. This chord is made out of the notes F sharp, A, C, and E. There are many parallel keys that would give this sort of borrowed chord. For example, one of them is the C Lydian scale. The role of this chord is kind of interesting. Most often, I think it fulfills the role of some sort of a surprise tonic. It's kind of weird when you think about it, but it works pretty well. As an example, let's take a famous song, Somewhere Over the Rainbow, and let's play it in two different ways. The first is kind of standard, quote unquote, where we have a C major 7th, going to an A minor 7th, going to an E minor 7th, to a C dominant 7th, and then to an F major 7th. In the second reharmonized version, let's use the borrowed chord that we've just introduced. And we're going to start out from this chord. We're also going to put in between this chord and the subsequent E minor 7th a secondary dominant for the E minor 7th, which would be a B dominant 7. So now it would sound like this. The borrowed chords I just mentioned are sort of the main meat, or the most frequently encountered ones, and should give you a lot to think about if you just focus on them. Nevertheless, I'm going to quickly mention a few more that might be worth considering. The first is first two are actually a pair, which are the 1 dominant 7 and the 4 dominant 7. In the key of C major, these would be a C dominant 7 and an F dominant 7. And they play the sort of expected roles, functional roles. The 1 dominant 7th plays the role of a tonic, and the 4 dominant 7th plays the role of a subdominant. And their uniqueness is in really giving the tonic and subdominant a bluesy feel. So for example, if you're playing a C major 7 to an F major 7th to a G dominant 7th to a C major 7th, you could instead play a C dominant 7th to an F dominant 7th to a G dominant 7th and back to a C dominant 7th. It would sound like this. This gives a sort of bluesy Gershwin type feel to the progression. Another interesting chord to consider is the flattened 2 major 7th chord. In the key of C major, this would be a D flat major 7th. And this can be thought of as either a dominant chord, because it leads to the tonic, or maybe sort of a passing chord, or maybe a delaying chord that anticipates the tonic. So for example, when playing a 2-5-1, you can maybe substitute the D flat major 7th for the G dominant 7th, or maybe stick it in there between the G dominant 7th and the resolution, the C major 7th. So it would sound like this. For our last borrowed chord, let's look at the flattened 6 major 7th. In the key of C major, this would be an A flat major 7th. Functionally, this plays the role of a subdominant because it leads quite naturally into the dominant chord. So for example, again, let's say you're playing a C major 7th to an A minor 7th to an F major 7th to a G dominant 7th, and back to C major 7th, you could substitute the F major 7th for the A flat major 7th. It would sound like this. This concludes our video on borrowed chords. My point here was that this whole idea of modal interchange or borrowed chords is kind of a big name for basically a bunch of chords that people tend to use quite a lot. Chords that don't belong to the scale or to the key that you're playing in, but still do fulfill a functional role of some sort. In the next lesson, we'll be looking at tritone substitutions. That's it for now. I hope you've learned something interesting, and I'll see you next time.